Art is a weapon. Art has been part of human social life for about 50,000 years. What does art do for us? It's a form of communication of ideas and situations. It mediates relationships between people, even when they don't live in the same place or time. It reaches us through emotional pathways, affecting us differently from simple observation or logic. Guernica is a powerful anti-war painting because it uses symbolic language to evoke the emotional horror of a town being torn apart as it's bombed. Art is not simply an imitation of life. It concentrates experiences. It also shapes consciousness. Bell Hooks tells us the function of art is to do more than tell it like it is. It's to imagine what's possible. Books, especially stories, can affect people's entire lives. We're natural storytellers and weave the patterns of our lives into stories. Maxim Gorky's Mother is considered the first proletarian novel, written in 1907 describing events in Russia in 1905. I've met people from opposite ends of the world who were first politicized as teenagers by reading Mother. It continues to move people very deeply, long after it was written and long after the events it depicts have receded into the distant past. Art can also provide historical context, a way of understanding different circumstances that is more personal and immediate than a strictly informative text or photograph, like André Normal's painting Night of Fire, which depicts revolutionaries in Haiti making a collective pledge not to reveal the planned slave revolt in 1791. Art is a concentration of life, a condensation of reality into something more intense, deep, or extreme. Caricature is a prime example. It can reveal the true nature of something that's usually concealed under the surface. This drawing of Louis-Philippe I of France, titled Gargantua, was drawn in 1831. It got Daumier, the artist, 6 months in prison. This drawing by George Grosz shows the underlying character of the bourgeoisie more viscerally than any text could describe them. Art can inspire people to do things. It can express our ideas and dreams about the future. It makes ideas accessible. Art, like everything, is ideological. The opinion that art should have nothing to do with politics is itself a political attitude. By ideology, I mean the set of convictions that determine one's approach to life. All art is propaganda. I use that word in a neutral sense, as the assertion of any specific message directed to a particular group or section of people. We are trained to think of truth as a collection of information, of objective facts. But objectivity is only relatively possible. It's always affected by politics or relations of power. In any class-divided society, objectivity is a mask for class domination. One cannot be neutral when living in a class-divided society. You either take one side or the other. It's impossible to leave politics out. As Orwell noted, the attempt is in itself political. We are subjective beings. We each bring our own theory of the world to our observations of it. Our choices are subjective. In everything we do, we are enacting an ideology, if not consciously our own, then someone else's. Mao was also very aware of this. He said there is in fact no such thing as art for art's sake, art that stands above classes, art that is detached from or independent of politics. Culture asserts class interests. There are very different class interests expressed in this and this. When two forces in society are in conflict, then culture is a battlefield. These two paintings are both of women with flags, but their goals are clearly very different and antagonistic to each other. Their subject may be superficially the same, but their ideologies are opposed, and it's their ideology that defines their character, their meaning, and their social effect. The world is filled with people who try to make slaves of all of us, and they have their music and we have ours. Woody Guthrie said that. We know that the message of this music is quite different from this one, and that the class interests being promoted with this are not the same as those promoted by that. and it's clear that there is a huge difference between anti-imperialist culture and culture celebrating imperialist aggression and conquest. Capitalists have two main interests in art. First, making money. This is always their first priority in everything they do. The top art dealer in the US, according to Forbes magazine, brings in $925 million a year with his 11 galleries. Here he is, Larry Gagosian, with Jeff Koons, one of the artists he makes all that money off of. Koons' sculpture, which is called Balloon Dog Orange, was sold for $58.4 million in 2013, the world record highest price for a piece by a living artist sold at auction. In a period of economic crisis, surplus capital has to go somewhere, right? And the second interest capitalists have in art is to preserve their ability to make money. In other words, they need for us not to overthrow them. To win and captivate hearts and minds, they pour huge amounts of resources and effort into shaping the cultural milieu. Their culture is designed and imposed for mind control to make us identify with them and repudiate our own interests. It's been very effective. You can call it by different names: ideological domination, brainwashing, Stockholm Syndrome, socialization, conditioning, the news. But in every case, its purpose is to protect the interests of dominant classes and pacify the masses. As they say about television, they call it programming for a reason. To achieve their goals, they work very hard to set the terms of what is good art. What are the standards they say they promote? Beauty, creativity, a truthful evocation of a mood or scene, a transformational experience. But a painting can be conventionally pretty and realistic, but these don't automatically make it good. Beauty depends on one's ideology. Beauty is in the streets, says the Situationist International poster from France, 1968. We shouldn't ignore artistic standards. They are qualities of art that affect their initial appeal and help people open up to it. But apologists for capitalism, like many academics, argue that politics don't belong in art at all, that it taints the purity of the work. For them, art is not supposed to have a message. If it does have one, in particular an explicitly anti-capitalist one, it's often delegitimized with words like preachy. Suddenly, artistic quality becomes the only criteria for judgment. But if our art is to be a social force against the system, we need to prioritize another element, and that is a consciously anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist political line. Artists under capitalism are offered a choice. Most are led by fantasies of money and fame. The other choice, presented as more noble, is to reject these crass aims in favor of the satisfaction of self-expression, of having a platform for our profound and unique inner thoughts, our beautiful personal feelings. And what are we not supposed to want or even to think about? Social change. But as the Egyptian novelist Nawal el-Saadawi says, you cannot be creative in a system that is very unjust, like the system we live in, unless you are a dissident. As artists under capitalism, we're in a bind. This society turns everything into a commodity, puts a price on it. This is a relentless pressure on art to conform to the needs of the market. Can we escape this and still make a living? Probably not. Very few can do it. It's essentially an unsolvable problem because our framework is capitalism and everything happens on its terms. There are very few opportunities to sell out even if we wanted to. Usually no one's buying. Like for the underemployed in general, the problem isn't us, it's the economic conditions we're trapped in. The problem of artists needing money affects our work. We can't avoid that. We usually have to create things we don't care about just to sell in order to free up some time to create the things we do care about. This is especially the case in mediums that are expensive. Warren Beatty had to make a lot of crap movies before he had enough money and clout to do what he really wanted. This is improving today with popular technologies like YouTube and SoundCloud and crowdfunding tools like Patreon, Kickstarter, and Indiegogo. The audiences for these are still conditioned by the dominant ideology, though, So a comic strip about cats or the internet, never mind the gold mine of combining both, is usually going to be more popular than one about proletarian theory, with the rare exception. But mostly we're still having to choose between money and saying what we really want to say. Even when progressive or revolutionary artists manage to bring messages into the mainstream and have a big social impact, this will usually be quite limited. They still have to conform to the market, to what is sellable. But we can't leave the cultural battlefield to the enemy. That would be surrendering. We need to break outside their framework. As Steve Biko famously said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. The same is true for us. We need to break the enemy's ideological chains, holding back our hearts and minds, if we're to emancipate ourselves politically and economically as well, and overturn their entire system of domination and exploitation. The capitalist class understands this extremely well, and they act on this understanding. Following World War II, the U.S. formed the CIA. Their mission was to assert U.S. interests abroad and to weaken the Soviet Union. They wanted to check the attraction that communism held for the international working class. Their covert action programs over the next couple of decades and beyond involved youth groups, labor unions, universities, publishing houses, and other private institutions. With the added weapon of McCarthyism, they twisted and constrained U.S. culture, as well as exerted tremendous influence in Europe. They funded influential magazines that would otherwise have gone under, helped publish more than 1,000 books that otherwise never would have seen the light of day, buying thousands of copies to distribute. They funded international tours of musical performances and art exhibitions and formed artist organizations in many countries. They were involved in the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Time Magazine, Partisan Review, and many, many other projects. At the same time, they blocked the spread of art that didn't fit their program, like the novelist Howard Fast, who served prison time for being a communist. The publication of his novels, which had been very popular, were directly impeded by the government. The CIA involved rich people in their projects, funneling huge sums of money through private foundations so that artists wouldn't know who they were really beholden to. These included the Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie foundations. The founders of the Museum of Modern Art were Abby Rockefeller and her two friends, and its president during most of the 1940s and 50s was her son Nelson Rockefeller, who later became the governor of New York. It's been called the most influential museum in the world, easily making and breaking the careers of artists at its discretion. And what did they force down the throat of U.S. culture? They gave us this. There's a book that describes this history, The Cultural Cold War, the CIA and the World of Arts and Letters, by Francis Stondon Saunders. Here's a quote from it. Abstract Expressionism spoke to a specifically anti-communist ideology, the ideology of freedom, of free enterprise. Non-figurative and politically silent, it was the very antithesis of socialist realism. Rockefeller alone collected more than 2,500 abstract expressionist paintings for his private collection and thousands more to decorate the lobbies and walls of his Chase Manhattan banks. Now, because of mergers, it's the J.P. Morgan Chase Art Collection, and in its own words, it presents works by international artists who are shaping the future through their innovation and creative vision, celebrating a half-century of collecting and philanthropic support for arts and culture. Our commitment to excellence, diversity, and originality remains steadfastly the heart of our approach. Art is ideological warfare. Rockefeller and the current major shareholders of J.P. Morgan Chase & Company, incidentally the largest U.S. bank with assets of more than $2.5 trillion, and the rest of the capitalist class all understand the need to control the art that the public is exposed to. In their interests, the CIA successfully stripped politics out of visual arts. Now this has become the generally accepted view. It's taken as a given that art should not be tainted by politics, must remain pure and transcendent over worldly concerns. This is what's taught in universities, rewarded with grants, and sold in galleries. This ideology is the culmination of a conscious campaign by capitalists in order to solidify their power. They weren't stupid enough to only fund overtly pro-American or right-wing culture. They consciously cultivated what they called the non-communist left. This was done in order to divide society in their favor, to capture progressives under the wing of capital and isolate any truly radical alternatives. Before the CIA was even formed, the bourgeoisie attempted to buy off communist artists and water down their work. Nelson Rockefeller promoted Diego Rivera and gave him a one-person show at MoMA. People wondered why, until Abby Rockefeller, Nelson's mom, said that Reds would stop being Reds if we could give them artistic recognition. In 1933, Rockefeller hired Diego Rivera to paint a mural in the lobby of Rockefeller Center. As it was being painted, the press expressed the fear that it would advocate communism. In response, Diego Rivera added this. Nelson asked him to remove it. Diego refused. He was instantly fired, and the unfinished mural, called Man at the Crossroads, was destroyed. They had already paid him $21,000 for the work, though, which he kept. He also recreated the mural in Mexico. This incident, in spite of the destruction of the art itself, was a win for the working class. This is because Diego Rivera asserted his autonomy and working class interests and was willing to push the contradiction into an open conflict that affected public discourse and set a good example of not surrendering. Though that particular case was unsuccessful for the capitalists, it did not deter them from the practice of artistic patronage. CIA control over the arts was exposed by the radical magazine Ramparts in the 1970s, causing a huge scandal. But did that make them end the practice? I don't see why we should assume that. Perhaps instead they just learned to hide it better. The J.P. Morgan Chase Art Collection currently owns 30,000 works of art. Capitalists have organized power, unlimited funds, and will use any means to attempt to manipulate us and divert our energies into political dead ends that don't challenge that power. The situation now is that inside their framework, and because we're dependent on selling work to survive in an economy that belongs to them, it's very difficult to retain autonomy. Here's a piece by an artist exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art today. I'm not saying that Shepard Fairey is consciously cooperating with the state, but in his work he uses a lot of pseudo-left imagery. What's he actually trying to subvert with this? This is the same guy, by the way, who designed this. So-called culture jamming has become ubiquitous among supposedly dissident art. Adbusters, the originator of this technique, pairs imagery and texts that evoke radical change or revolution and mixes them together randomly, such as a picture of Gandhi with a Rosa Luxemburg quote, so they present no coherent ideology. In fact, the editor Kalle Lasson has said that Adbusters, quote, isn't mired in the old ideology of the left and right, end quote. So what do they replace that with? They say they're trying to clean up the mental environment. What does that mean? This is now the model for a supposedly anti-capitalist magazine. But does it actually weaken capitalism? Perhaps it does. They did have a role in the Occupy phenomenon, but only with the help of an expensive PR firm. This general question needs to be further examined. And what about this? Banksy is supposedly subverting capitalism all over the place. But what does a piece like this actually do? It seems oppositional, but is it actually making the West Bank Wall a bit more palatable? Is it having a revolutionary effect or a pacifying effect? These are questions we have to be asking ourselves. Last year I met someone working within the capitalist framework, a university. Edie Pistolesi is a professor of art education at the California State University at Northridge, CSUN. She was recently called into the office of the head of the department to be chastised because some students complained that she was too political. And some of the professors give her a very hard time as well. But many of her other students love her politics and have their eyes opened by her teaching. And she has tenure, so she often declares that she can say whatever she wants. And she does. She turns her lessons into group art projects, so that someone who thought they were taking a class to learn how to teach third graders how to trace their hands to draw Thanksgiving turkeys wind up learning about capitalism and political art as well. So even though a university setting is constrained and limited, it is possible to assert anti-capitalist ideas and culture if one is determined and willing to constantly do battle with those who would tame them. Each of us must make a decision about our art and our lives in general. Who are we serving? Are we serving the system as it currently exists and those who control it? Or are we serving the people being dominated and exploited by global capitalism by exposing its conditions and injustices and pointing a way forward for our collective emancipation? What is the purpose of art for us? For the bourgeoisie, art is for pleasure and consumption. For us, art is for thought, for learning, for struggle. Art can be used to educate, like the posters produced by the Beehive Collective. It can attack and ridicule the enemy, like these pieces by Robbie Cannell, Ted Rall, this poster by someone I don't know but I just love it, and John Hartfield. Art can encourage resistance, like this piece by Eric Drucker, and make a political point, like George Gross ridiculing the United Front Line, which promoted working-class collaboration with some sections of capital against others. This image makes just as strong a critique as any essay possibly could. The job of the writer is to make revolution irresistible. Like this film, Lal Salam, about the Naxalites in India, art can advocate a path of struggle. We have to balance speaking to the level of our audience while introducing new ideas into the conversation without being alienating. This can be tricky. We can improve our ability to communicate an effective message by actually engaging our audiences in a back-and-forth process by building relationships with them. If our audience doesn't understand what we're trying to express or relate to it, that's our fault. It's our job to make our work understandable and relevant. Any revolutionary who underestimates the material power of ideas is certain to fail. In our period of history, it has proved stronger than the power of material poverty. Anyone who doubts this should see what happens when artists step out of line and gain social influence with messages threatening to the power structure. Is this painting threatening? In Los Angeles, the police came to the artist, Alex Schaefer, while he was painting outside and said someone had called them who did feel threatened by his subject matter. They asked if he was a terrorist and if he was planning to actually set the bank on fire. He replied to the police that a terrorist certainly would not spend hours on a public sidewalk creating an oil painting of his intended target. I will never be your clown or wear a painted smile. A real artist is prepared to say what needs to be said, even knowing that the consequences could be extreme. This was drawn by Ali Ferzat, a Syrian cartoonist critical of Assad. Is this cartoon threatening? Here's what happened to him in 2011. Security forces broke his hands and told him he'd never draw cartoons again. But he has continued. He stated, "I was born to be a cartoonist, to oppose, to have differences with regimes that do these bad things. This is what I do." A month before that, the composer of a popular anti-regime song was found dead with his vocal cords cut out. Ferzat was able to leave the country, but another Syrian cartoonist who drew this, Akram Raslan, was not so lucky. He was captured with a bunch of other intellectuals and artists and shot. If you would be a poet, create works capable of answering the challenges of apocalyptic times. Dred Scott Tyler's "What is the Proper Way to Display a U.S. Flag" created a huge stir in 1988. The images on the wall depict South Korean students burning U.S. flags and holding signs saying "Yankee Go Home," and flag-draped coffins in a troop transport plane. He invited the audience to write their answers to that question in the book, but to do so, they must step on the flag. His motivation was this: to make revolutionary art, to propel history forward, confront the world as it is, and radically dream about how it could be different. President Bush wasn't so happy about that. The controversy led to legislation and a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Senate passed legislation in 1989 to protect the U.S. flag from desecration. Undermining the regime is good. We need to weaken the class in power. But without building the strength of those in opposition to it, we won't be able to actually transform society. We can't just feel good about expressing our dissent and then go home with nothing, with no organized mass strength. Art can also be an organizing tool. To be most effective, we should use our work as a way to build relationships with people and bring them into the struggle. Art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it. We need to step outside the gallery, the studio, the website, and engage with the people we're attempting to affect. We need to involve them in the process. If we sit inside and write or paint about experiences we didn't have or things we don't know, then no matter how radical or revolutionary the message seems, it ultimately is just a bluff. We must get out among people, learn what's going on with them, their experiences and dreams and fears. No amount of inventing can hide ignorance. It shows. It leads to work that's not believable. As Mao said, no investigation, no right to speak. Artists who are organizers are not very common. Our class character tends to make us individualistic. Many of us are natural loners. The stereotypical attitude of an unsuccessful artist is that of the misunderstood genius. And for the successful one, it's to act like some diva who only cares about self-expression and the art itself, never mind its social effects or consequences. We need to combat these tendencies in and among ourselves. There are many ways to take art into the streets. Here are puppets at a protest and some great street theater, Billionaires for Bush. And here's the Yes Men on the news in 2004, successfully impersonating Dow corporate executives finally taking responsibility for Union Carbide's gas leak 20 years earlier that killed up to 16,000 people in Bhopal, India, and injured more than 500,000 more. The stock price of Dow, the owner of Union Carbide, dropped $2 billion in value in 23 minutes before the company denied the report. Seth Tubackman was involved in the anti-gentrification and squatters movement in New York in the 1980s. He's still a housing advocate today and still produces art that appears on protest signs and the walls of the city. The Guerrilla Girls organized as artists for artists, specifically for elevating the position of women artists, but their work also served as a social critique against the oppression of women in general. Here's a Zapatista mural in a village in Mexico. This is not only a great and provocative album, but Boots Riley was also an organizer at Occupy Oakland. There is only one task: to accelerate through every available means the downfall of this oppressive culture. This interactive sign by Steve Lambert has been traveling around to various locations since 2011. He says, "For me, art is a bridge that connects uncommon, idealistic, or even radical ideas with everyday life. I carefully craft various conditions where I can discuss these ideas with people and have a mutually meaningful exchange. I want my art to be relevant to those outside the gallery, say at the nearest bus stop." So there are many approaches to making art public and to draw people into the process. Art is not only an outward expression of the artist, but a back-and-forth communication. There is no greater honor for a political artist than when our artwork is used in people's struggles. This is ultimately what it's made for. A cartoon by Ted Rall was recently turned into this poster at a university in Delhi. It says, "Expose America's real agenda, defeat imperialist designs in the name of the war on terror." The workers' organization Bataille Ouvrière in Haiti asked me to translate this cartoon into Creole so they could put it on a leaflet that garment workers would pass out in front of factories during their fight for a higher wage. For me, that drawing achieved its highest possible usefulness. The moment of change is the only poem. Art and politics have a mutually enriching relationship. Art brings a certain spirit of creativity and soul to political struggle. And art is at its best, its most lofty, when it serves the cause of emancipation. It's an important weapon in the battle of ideas, and we need to use it consciously and creatively. Nothing, not all the armies of the world, can stop an idea whose time has come. Art by itself may not save the world, but it inspires those who will.